We will now begin the joint interactive dialogue. Can you please take your seats? We will now begin the joint interactive dialogue with the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and the independent international fact-finding mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran, pursuant to the Council's Resolution 58/21 of 3rd April 2025. I have the pleasure of welcoming the mandate holder, Mrs. Mai Sato, the Special Rapporteur, and the distinguished members of the fact-finding mission, Mrs. Sarah Hossein, Chair, Mrs. Viviana Kristichevich, and Mr. Max Duplessis. Allow me to recall that on 18 March 2025, the Council decided that the time allocated to mandate holders within the framework of this joint interactive dialogue be 12 minutes for each mechanism, and that the speaking time for the country concerned by this joint interactive dialogue be 6 minutes. The speaking time for other delegations would be 1 minute and 30 seconds. If time allows, more speakers can be accommodated. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to the Special Rapporteur to present her report.
Thank you. Mr. President, distinguished delegates, and representatives of civil society. When I assumed this mandate in August 2024, the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran was already deeply troubling. I warned then that by the end of 2025, the number of executions could exceed 1,000. In the end, over 1,600 people were executed in 2025. Digital space was already subject to extensive restrictions, with some international platforms blocked and surveillance mechanisms embedded in communications infrastructure. Civic space was already severely curtailed, with laws and policies rendering almost all forms of unsanctioned collective action unlawful. And from previous mass movements, the patterns were clear. Forced confessions broadcast on state television, lawyers defending protesters disbarred and detained, protesters labeled terrorists and mercenaries. What distinguishes the most recent mass movement from violations long reported by this mandate is not so much the nature of the state's response, but the scale of both the mobilization and the repression it has provoked. In connection with the nationwide protests, over 7,000 deaths have been reported by civil society, with more under review. Tens of thousands of protesters were reportedly detained. So too were medical professionals who treated the wounded and lawyers who sought to represent them. What are widely regarded as forced confessions were again broadcast on state television. Protests were again labeled terrorists, and members of minority groups were once again scapegoated as foreign agents, a pattern of persecution that long predates the current crisis. At least 30 individuals, including children, reportedly faced the death penalty in connection with the protests. What was new, and what has left a profound impression on me, was the violation of medical neutrality. Hospitals were raided, wounded protesters arrested from their beds, medical professionals assaulted and arrested. A state directive instructing hospitals to provide information on injured protesters. The result was a healthcare system in which the injured feared seeking treatment more than the injuries themselves, and the act of saving life criminalized. The volume of submissions I received for my report to this Council was extraordinary. I received submissions from individuals with no prior history of activism who had never before engaged with my mandate, and they did so at considerable risk. That speaks not to the strength of my mandate, but to the gravity of what people of Iran witnessed and experienced. Mr. President, my mandate exists for the people of Iran. It does not matter who the perpetrator is. When foreign states strike, now for the second time in less than a year, the people harmed are the same people. I have condemned the US and Israel's attacks as unlawful under the UN Charter last year and this time again. The strikes remain unlawful, no matter the assumed or stated objectives of those strikes. International law is not selectively invoked. It applies to all parties in all circumstances. The human cost of the current strikes is already severe. Over 1,000 civilians have reportedly been killed, a primary school struck, and hospitals and World Heritage sites destroyed. Strikes on oil infrastructure have caused toxic environmental consequences with the possibility of serious long-term public health effects. This in a country that was already experiencing acute water shortages. My mandate has long reported serious concerns of treatment of detainees from medical neglect, ill treatment to deaths in custody. Since publishing my report, the military escalation heightened concerns about all detainees, including those arrested in connection with the protests. Families report not being able to reach their loved ones, and worrying reports of acute food shortages, medical care are emerging. Today, 3 million people are temporarily displaced inside the Islamic Republic of Iran. The reported absence of functional air raid sirens and bomb shelters in many urban areas add to the concerns about basic civilian protection during hostilities. The internet shutdown imposed during the nationwide protests has been followed by a second in the wake of the military escalation, cutting people off from information and connectivity when they need it most. I am aware that the people in Iran cannot hear my words despite this session being live-streamed. The people of Iran have endured an astonishing accumulation of violence and loss. A military escalation followed by a crackdown, and then a nationwide protest met with lethal force and mass detention. And before they could draw breath, the military strikes again. They have been killed, detained, displaced, and cut off from the world, caught between sanctions and relentless repression. There has been so much violence and so much death. Mr. President, if we put the people of Iran at the heart of any solution, the military escalation must stop and all parties must resume diplomatic dialogue immediately. Any path forward must be grounded in human rights, the will of the Iranian people, and full accountability for violations of international law by all parties. When the strikes stop, the international community must not look away from what happened in December and the long-standing grievances. The people of Iran continue to be united by a deep desire for a different future, calling for fundamental change. They exercise their right to self-determination. That must be the center of any solution. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the chair of the fact-finding mission to present the report of the fact-finding mission. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies and delegates, I speak today on behalf of the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission on the Islamic Republic of Iran and for my fellow members, Viviana Krstičević and Max Duplessis. In April 25, the Council requested us to investigate recent and ongoing serious human rights violations in Iran. Since then, we've collected hundreds of evidence items and conducted interviews with 164 victims and witnesses, both inside and outside the country. We've also examined nearly 30 reports from the government of Iran. As you've heard, today the Iranian people are caught between a large-scale military campaign by two countries, the US and Israel, and ongoing repression by their own government in Iran. In this context, we'll provide the results of our work in three groups. First, we'll share information we've gathered on the regional armed conflict and the impact on civilians. Second, we'll update you on our ongoing investigations into the protests that began on 28th December last year and their repression. Third, we'll share our factual and legal findings related to the human rights violations and international crimes that were committed in Iran in 2025 up till December in the breakout of the protests. Turning first to the conflict. On 20th February, the US and Israel launched a devastating aerial campaign against Iran, ostensibly targeting military sites and nuclear facilities. In almost 3 weeks, these strikes have resulted in mounting reports of civilian casualties, including of children. Hospitals, schools, cultural heritage sites, residential areas, multiple oil depots and a desalination plant have been struck, damaged and destroyed, resulting in severe harm to civilians. On the very first day of this campaign, the airstrikes destroyed a school in Minab in southern Iran, killing more than 168 people, the vast majority of them being girl students, many as young as 7 years old. Against this backdrop, we are particularly concerned by public statements from US officials suggesting that long-established rules of engagement do not apply in this conflict. We will continue to monitor compliance with international humanitarian law of all parties to the conflict and to gather evidence in this regard. This situation has taken place just as the Iranian people have barely begun to emerge from the unprecedented horrors and violence unleashed upon them by their own government, the government of Iran, following the protests that began on 20th December 2025, when millions of Iranis took to the streets across the country, first in relation to the economic crisis and then to demand fundamental change. We have been receiving reports about the killings and injuries that took place in the acts of suppression of these protests. On 8th of January this year, the deaths and injuries escalated significantly, immediately after the government of Iran imposed another internet shutdown. Reports indicate that security forces began to use military-grade weapons, including heavy machine guns, against protesters and bystanders during this period. Credible organizations suggest that over 7,000 people have been killed, far exceeding the government's own staggering claim of 3,117 fatalities over just a few days. Reports indicate that security forces injured people on a broad scale, including by blinding them with metal pellet ammunition fired from shotguns, recalling the shocking patterns we saw during the Women, Life and Freedom movement being suppressed. After the government crushed these protests, security forces carried out large-scale detentions, with credible information that more than 50,000 people were held. They included, as you've heard, doctors who were arrested simply for treating the injured. Victims continue to demand truth, justice and accountability for the violations that occurred during these recent protests and those that have occurred earlier. But we must be clear that justice cannot be delivered through war and can only be pursued through accountability measures grounded in the law. Mr. President, I will now move to the factual and legal findings set out in our mandated report, which concern the period from 18th March to 27th December of 2025. First, in the context of the armed conflict then between Iran and Israel in June 2025, we found reasonable grounds to believe that in carrying out the airstrikes on Evin prison, Israel committed the war crime of intentionally directing attacks against a civilian object, killing 80 people, including at least 1 child and 8 women. Second, Iranian authorities themselves failed to protect detainees held at Evin prison and other places and refused to disclose the fate or whereabouts of some transferred detainees from Evin in acts amounting to enforced disappearance. Third, in the aftermath of the conflict, we found that the Iranian state increased measures of repression to suppress dissent through large-scale arrest, detention and criminal prosecutions. Ethnic and religious minorities were subjected to such prosecutions without respect for due process or fair trial rights. Journalists, human rights defenders and social media users were targeted for expressing their views on the conflict or merely for calling for peace. Fourth, rather than dismantling its system of institutionalized and structural discrimination, Iran continued to use mandatory hijab laws and rules as a tool to repress women and girls. Fifth, acts of transnational repression against journalists and human rights defenders reporting on Iran from abroad also increased during and after the June hostilities. These included assassination attempts and death threats and harassment of the families of these people inside the country. As you've already heard, executions rose sharply during and after the June hostilities, with an appalling 1,639 recorded during the year, exceeding the global total of known executions for the previous year. Immediately after the strikes ended, in the 3 months between July and September, at least 464 executions were recorded. In the next month, in October, a further 222 people were executed, the highest monthly total recorded in 25 years. The core lesson drawn from our investigations in this context is clear. External military action does not provide accountability, nor does it bring meaningful change. Instead, it risks intensifying domestic repression by a state that routinely resorts to repressive measures to suppress its own people and to suppress dissent. We are deeply concerned that the current security situation may again, as in June 25, be used to escalate repression and to punish those who have dared to express dissent. Excellencies, given the systematic pattern of violations we've identified, practical transformative measures are required now. First, we call on all parties to urgently and unconditionally end hostilities. We call on the international community to de-escalate tensions and resume a credible and good faith dialogue on peace, human rights, justice, and equal and inclusive participation in political and public affairs. There's an urgent need to ensure full respect for international law to protect civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. Second, we call on Iran to cease intimidation, harassment and arbitrary detention and implement a moratorium on the use of the death penalty. Transformative change is urgently required, one that ensures the voices of all Iranians, including women, young people and minorities, can be expressed freely and without fear for their security, and that guarantees their ability to participate meaningfully in the public affairs of their country. Third, we call on states to ensure that viable legal pathways, including humanitarian visas, remain open for victims and their families in Iran. Acts of transnational repression should be investigated and those responsible prosecuted. Effective remedies and measures of protection for victims of such repression must be ensured. Fourth and finally, it is essential to preserve evidence of human rights violations and international crimes in the context we've described. There must be a firm commitment to pursuing justice and change through lawful accountability measures and not through violence. War cannot deliver the outcomes that truth, justice, due process and transformative reparations can achieve. I thank you.
Thank you. In accordance with our practice, we will begin by hearing from the delegations of the countries concerned. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Islamic Republic of Iran. You have a total of 6 minutes.
Mr. Vice President, today the most urgent and fundamental human rights issue concerning Iran is the imminent threat to lives of Iranian people, whose lives are in immediate and grave danger under the shadow of reckless military aggression. An aggression that is carried out by some of the most lawless and unscrupulous actors on the international stage and by individuals who demonstrate no restraint in killing civilians or in trampling upon the most basic and universally recognized human rights. At this moment, to speak of anything other than these crimes and this act of aggression would itself amount to a grave dereliction of responsibility and a flagrant disregard for the human rights of Iranian people. Today, the Human Rights Council and the Special Procedures mandate holders must speak unequivocally about the innocent children massacred at their school desks. This Council must raise its voice for the people whose millennia-old cultural heritage has been turned into a target of indiscriminate and unlawful attacks. It must also speak for residents forced to breathe air contaminated with toxic pollutants released as a direct consequence of these assaults. Mr. Vice President, for 15 years in this very Council, certain Western countries have persistently advanced unfounded and politically motivated allegations of human rights violations against Iran, thereby laying the groundwork for the very aggression that we are witnessing today. Minor and isolated issues in Iran were deliberately exaggerated and portrayed as grave and systematic violations in order to manufacture a pretext to normalize hostility against Iran. Through sustained political pressure and propaganda, Iran was gradually portrayed as a legitimate target. The carpet bombing of civilians in Iran and the infliction of needless, superfluous suffering are the direct consequences of the impunity granted to those who engage in perfidy and repeatedly betray the very principles of negotiation and multilateralism. The invasion of Iran amid ongoing negotiations was not merely a betrayal of diplomacy itself. It was a betrayal of very ideals of human rights and of the conscience of humanity. At the same time, these same deliberately concealed for more egregious violations, including the devastating humanitarian consequences of unlawful sanctions and two manifest acts of aggression against Iran. If this were not the case, why did these countries remain conspicuously silent in the face of the killing of innocent school children in Minab? Why was such a heinous crime not unequivocally condemned? And why the fundamental issue of aggression as the most serious violation of international law and the blatant violation of the Iranian people's right to life has been overshadowed by peripheral political narratives? Mr. Vice President, in recent weeks, hospitals in Iran have been bombed, drinking water infrastructures have been deliberately targeted, and homes have been destroyed over the heads of their inhabitants. Only in the first 10 days of the invasions, near 14,000 civilians units that includes more than 20 hospitals and further emergency bases were targeted in airstrikes. Under such circumstances, what exactly Iran is expected to do? Do those who launched these attacks or those who encouraged, enabled, and facilitated them possess even the most basic understanding of Iran's history, culture, and civilization? Iran is not a nation that submits to coercion, intimidation, or lawless aggression. Today, in the face of the more than 1,300 innocent lives lost and over 7,000 people injured, including a 6-month-old baby struggling for his life, the international community must not remain silent. The families of the more than 300 women and girls who have been killed are looking to the Human Rights Council for justice and for a clear and principled response. If the response of this Council is once again silence, indifference, or political selectivity, then it would be the end of the Council's stand, after it was severely diminished because of its inaction during the Israel crimes in Gaza. Mr. Vice President, Iran was subjected to aggression while it was actively engaged in negotiations and had explicitly affirmed its commitment to a peaceful and diplomatic resolution. This reality sends a clear and unmistakable message to the international community. And the message is that if reckless militarism, the erosion of multilateralism, and the systematic disregard for genuine human rights are met with silence or indifference, Iran will most certainly not be the last country to suffer such treatment. Finally, I have to reaffirm Iran is resolute in defending its people, its sovereignty, and its territorial integrity. In the exercise of its inherent right of self-defense under international law, Iran will respond decisively to any act of aggression. I thank you.
Thank you. The list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to put questions to the Special Rapporteur and members of the fact-finding mission and to make comments on the reports. I would like to remind you that speaking time is limited to 1 minute and 30 seconds for each intervention. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I am pleased to speak on behalf of Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. We thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their vital updates. We are closely following developments in the Middle East and are deeply concerned about the mounting loss of life. We condemn the dangerous and destabilizing strikes by Iran on civilians and civilian infrastructure across the region. We implore all parties to de-escalate tensions, protect civilians and civilian infrastructure, and prioritize pathways to diplomacy. We fear that Iran's unprecedented response to dissent earlier this year, marked by unlawful killings, arbitrary detentions, disappearances, torture, and internet shutdowns, will only intensify as regional tensions escalate. We affirm the rights of Iranians related to peaceful protests and support legitimate aspirations to decide their own future. Iran's use of the death penalty, over 1,600 executions in 2025, and more than 100 in January 26 alone, is intolerable. We also remain deeply concerned by the persecution of ethnic and religious minorities, including the Baha'i, Kurds, and Baluchis, and by the systemic discrimination women and girls face in public and private life. We call on Iran to halt repression, including transnationally, release all those arbitrarily detained, stop executions, and comply with its international human rights obligations. Question. Medical staff and facilities caring for protesters have faced serious reprisals by Iranian authorities. How can states better support them? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Mr. Vice President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic states. During the special session in January, this Council strongly urged the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran to respect, protect and fulfill its human rights obligations. Thousands have reportedly been killed in the violent repression of nationwide protests that began on 28 December 2025, with security forces using lethal force. Thousands more have been arrested and detained, and peaceful protesters have been sentenced to death. This comes alongside a sharp rise in executions, with at least 1,600 executions in 2025. We are alarmed by the reports of widespread restrictions on civic space, continued persecution of women and girls, persons belonging to minorities, and of human rights defenders and journalists. The lack of credible national accountability processes perpetuates an environment of fear and repression for the people of Iran. In this context, the work of the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur is ever more crucial. The ongoing armed conflict has added another dimension to an already profound human rights crisis in Iran. We urge de-escalation, respect by all for international law, including human rights law and humanitarian law, and encourage a return to diplomatic dialogue. Protection of civilians is of utmost importance. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Mr. Vice President, the EU thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for the reports. We are following the developments in Iran and the Middle East with the utmost concern. The hostilities have a far-reaching humanitarian impact. We call on all parties to protect civilians and respect international law, including IHL and the UN Charter. In January, peaceful protesters were responded by the security forces with brutal repression and lethal violence. Accountability is essential. We call on Iran to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained and to stop all executions. Expedited trials for peaceful protesters must be halted. The European Union is gravely concerned about harassment and reprisals, including transnational repression on EU soil. Human rights must be guaranteed for all, including for women and girls and persons belonging to religious and ethnic minorities. We urge full and permanent restoration of internet access. The EU strongly rejects Iran's practice of arbitrary detention of EU nationals, and we urge the authorities to release them. The EU has taken targeted restrictive measures against those responsible for serious human rights violations, and we will continue to do so. We also will further intensify our support to Iranian civil society and human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela on behalf of a group of countries.
Gracias, presidente. Venezuela realiza esta intervención en nombre del Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Durante los últimos 14 años, Irán ha estado sujeto a un mandato selectivo, políticamente motivado y confrontativo de la relatora especial. Irán ha sido objeto de sesiones especiales del Consejo de manera desproporcionada, incluido un mandato duplicado de investigación en la 35 sesión especial y una costosa resolución de casi $6.5 millones en la 39 sesión especial. Esa politización de los derechos humanos y el doble rasero no son aceptables. La imposición de medidas coercitivas unilaterales ha tenido un impacto profundo y adverso en los derechos humanos del pueblo iraní. Estas medidas han restringido el acceso a bienes esenciales y, además, han limitado la capacidad para diseñar, implementar y promover programas de desarrollo. Condenamos la imposición de medidas coercitivas unilaterales, así como las repetidas amenazas contra la integridad territorial y la soberanía de Irán. También condenamos la agresión militar contra Irán llevada a cabo en violación del derecho internacional por las fuerzas de Israel y sus aliados, que perturba gravemente la estabilidad regional y agrava la situación humanitaria y de seguridad. Reiteramos que la cooperación, el diálogo y la equidad constituyen las vías más eficaces para alcanzar los objetivos comunes. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Bahrain on behalf of the Cooperation Council for the Arab States of the Gulf.
شكرا سيد نائب الرئيس. تدين دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية والمملكة الأردنية الهاشمية الهجمات التي قامت بها الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية ضد أراضي دولنا والتي استهدفت مناطق مدنية وبنى تحتية حيوية وشكلت مخاطر جسيمة على سلامة السكان المدنيين وعلى أمن واستقرار المنطقة. وتؤكد مجددا أن مثل هذه الهجمات التي تستهدف دول ثالثة غير طرف في أي نزاع تشكل انتهاكا واضحا لسيادة الدول وسلامة أراضيها وتمثل خرقا للقانون الدولي ولا يمكن تبريرها تحت أي ذريعة. وفي هذا الصدد ترحب دولنا باعتماد قرار مجلس الأمن رقم 2817 برعاية 136 دولة الذي يدين بأشد العبارات الهجمات التي استهدفت دولنا ويدعو إلى وقف فوري لها. ترفض دولنا ما ورد في تقريري المقرر الخاص وبعثة تقاصي الحقائب الدولية من توصيف لهذه الهجمات بأنها ضربات انتقامية، فضلا عن غياب أي إدانة واضحة لها. أن مثل هذه التوصيف يفتقر إلى أي أساس قانوني أو واقعي، ومن شأنه أن يسبي الشرعية على أعمال عدوانية تعد غير مشروعة بكل وضوح بموجب القانون الدولي. من هذا المنطلق ندعو المقرر الخاص وبعثة تقاصي الحقائب والآليات المعنية في المجلس إلى عكس الطبيعة الحقيقية لهذه الهجمات وإلى إدانة هذا العدوان غير المبرر بشكل صريح، كما تطالب دولنا إيران بالامتثال الكامل لقرار مجلس الأمن 2817. شكرا.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mali. Mali, are you absent or is it? If absent, I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Albania thanks the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for their reports and reaffirms its strong support for their mandates. The findings presented today confirms a deeply alarming reality. The human rights situation in Iran continues to deteriorate at an unprecedented rate. We strongly condemn the excessive, disproportionate and lethal use of force by Iranian security forces against peaceful protesters. The targeting of civilians exercising their fundamental rights to freedom of expression, association and peaceful assembly constitutes a flagrant violation of international human rights law. Albania is particularly concerned about the widespread arbitrary arrests and detention. The persistent allegation of torture, enforced disappearances, incommunicado detention, ill-treatment and forced confessions are extremely alarming. Mr. Vice President, these violations are evidence of a broader system of repression and impunity that has persisted for decades. The scale of gravity of the reported violations underscores the urgent need to ensure accountability and end impunity. Albania also condemns the attacks of Iran against the neighbouring country. Albania stands with the Iranian people and supports their legitimate aspirations for dignity, freedom and full respect of their fundamental rights. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. República Dominicana agradece la presentación de los informes. Observamos con preocupación las conclusiones relativas a restricciones al espacio de derechos y libertades fundamentales, incluidas limitaciones al espacio cívico, al derecho de reunión pacífica y a la libertad de expresión, así como denuncias de uso desproporcionado de la fuerza en contextos de protesta. Nos preocupa la situación de las mujeres y niñas, así como de otros grupos en situación de vulnerabilidad, y subrayamos la importancia de garantizar la igualdad ante la ley y la protección efectiva de los derechos. En el contexto internacional actual, marcado por un deterioro de la seguridad regional y por recientes escaladas de tensiones que generan graves consecuencias humanitarias, reiteramos la importancia de privilegiar la contención, el respeto del derecho internacional por todas las partes y la protección de la población civil. En este sentido, subrayamos que los esfuerzos para reducir las tensiones, fortalecer los canales diplomáticos y promover soluciones pacíficas resultan esenciales para evitar mayores vulneraciones de derechos humanos y preservar la estabilidad regional y global. Alentamos al gobierno iraní a continuar los esfuerzos orientados a promover el diálogo y la cooperación con los mecanismos internacionales con miras a avanzar en la protección y promoción de los derechos humanos de todas las personas en el país. Muchas gracias, vicepresidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Philippines.
Mr. Vice President, the Philippines echoes the serious concern expressed by ASEAN foreign ministers over the escalation of conflict in the Middle East. This spiral of armed conflict has already claimed many innocent lives, including those of children. This cannot and should not be normalized. International humanitarian law is clear. Civilians and civilian infrastructure are not military targets. All states have a binding obligation to protect them at all times. Continued escalation poses a grave threat to lives and livelihoods within and beyond the region and to global peace, security, and development, with potentially devastating consequences for all. We are concerned about the safety of millions of migrant workers, including seafarers in the region. We express deep appreciation to the host governments, our close partners, for their cooperation and prompt and committed efforts to uphold their rights and well-being in this challenging situation. We call on all parties to cease hostilities, exercise utmost restraint, and return to diplomacy and dialogue, the only viable way towards peaceful and durable solutions to disputes. We must all recommit to international law and the UN Charter. Respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states must remain sacrosanct, as it is the cornerstone of international peace and security, indispensable for the enjoyment of human rights by all. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We align ourselves with the EU statement and thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their updates and crucial work. Iran needs to stop its unjustifiable attacks on neighbors and shipping routes immediately and cease its long-standing abuse of international law, including its illegal enrichment program. In light of the current situation, we reiterate our call for the protection of all civilians in Iran and the wider region, and for the full respect of international law and international humanitarian law. The people of Iran must be able to freely determine their future, without fear of repression, of arbitrary arrests, of sham trials, with excessive punishments, including the death penalty, without fear of the excessive force that the Iranian government has deployed against its own people again and again. Iran must end the abuses against its own population and uphold the human rights of all its citizens, no matter their gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, or religious background. We call on Iran to allow full and unhindered access to HRC mandates. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Vice-président. La France s'associe à l'intervention de l'Union européenne. L'escalade au Moyen-Orient doit cesser. L'Iran porte une responsabilité première en jouant depuis des années un rôle déstabilisant pour la région, comme pour la paix et la sécurité internationale. La France se tient aux côtés du peuple iranien pour qu'il puisse retrouver la paix et accéder à une vie digne et libre. Une solution diplomatique durable est nécessaire pour mettre fin à la guerre et pour que l'Iran cesse d'être une menace pour ses voisins et pour l'ensemble de la communauté internationale. La France a soutenu le renouvellement des mandats de votre mission d'établissement des faits et de rapporteur spécial, indispensable pour continuer de documenter et recueillir les preuves des violations des droits de l'homme commises par le régime iranien, et en particulier la répression brutale en janvier dernier des manifestations pacifiques des Iraniennes et des Iraniens qui ne réclamaient que l'exercice de leurs droits. Nous réaffirmons notre soutien et notre solidarité avec nos partenaires de la région, injustement ciblés par des frappes iraniennes, et rappelons que la protection des populations civiles est une priorité absolue, conformément au droit international humanitaire. Au Conseil de sécurité, la France a soutenu et coparrainé la résolution 2817 qui appelle l'Iran à cesser ses frappes indiscriminées contre les pays de la région et demande le respect de la liberté de navigation dans le détroit d'Ormuz. Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Belgium aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. Decades of systemic repression by the Iranian authorities have indeed led to a catastrophic human rights situation, with many of the violations committed by the government amounting to crimes against humanity. We condemn them in the strongest terms. We urge the authorities to immediately stop silencing this dissent and shielding perpetrators from responsibility and instead release all persons arbitrarily detained, establish a moratorium on executions and the internet shutdowns, and ensure accountability for victims and their families. The recent escalation of hostilities is further exacerbating the human rights situation. We call for immediate de-escalation, renewed efforts towards a credible political solution and full respect for international law. Iran must comply with Security Council Resolution 2817. IHL prohibits targeted or indiscriminate attacks on civilian infrastructure. All incidents must be investigated, including the reported bombing of a girls' school in Minab. Special Rapporteur, members of the FFM, we urge Iran to cooperate with your mandates. How can the international community most effectively support your work at this critical moment? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Gracias, presidente. La República Bolivariana de Venezuela expresa su profunda preocupación por la reciente sesión especial sobre la República Islámica de Irán, en la que bajo un clima de evidente politización y doble rasero se procedió a la renovación de mandatos impuestos que carecen de legitimidad, consenso y consentimiento por parte del Estado concernido. Reiteramos que los mecanismos que no cuentan con la anuencia del Estado concernido, lejos de fomentar un diálogo genuino, se convierten en herramientas de hostigamiento y presión geopolítica. Estos mandatos ignoran deliberadamente la realidad del pueblo de Irán, así como el impacto devastador de las ilegales medidas coercitivas unilaterales que atentan contra su derecho al desarrollo. Venezuela rechaza enérgicamente la instrumentalización de este Consejo para promover agendas de cambio de régimen mediante narrativas sesgadas y parcializadas. En ese sentido, al reivindicar el principio de autodeterminación de los pueblos y de soberanía nacional, no puede más que rechazar la acción militar contra el pueblo de Irán. Es imperativo que este foro recupere su naturaleza constructiva y objetiva, respetando la soberanía, la integridad territorial y la autodeterminación de los pueblos, tal como lo consagra la Carta de las Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice-président, la Suisse remercie la rapporteure spéciale et la mission d'établissement des faits pour leurs travaux indispensables. La Suisse est profondément alarmée par l'escalade rapide et dangereuse après les attaques militaires des États-Unis et d'Israël contre l'Iran, qui violent le principe de non-recours à la force et risquent la déstabilisation du Moyen-Orient. Une violation du principe de non-recours à la force existe également lorsque l'Iran dépasse les limites du droit à la légitime défense, ce qui est le cas pour une partie de ses ripostes. La Suisse appelle tous les acteurs à la retenue maximale et au plein respect du droit international. S'agissant de la situation à l'intérieur du pays, la Suisse déplore la répression violente des manifestations début 2026, en particulier l'usage de la force létale. Les restrictions à la liberté d'expression, les coupures d'Internet et les violations des garanties d'un procès équitable sont également en contradiction flagrante avec les obligations internationales de l'Iran. La Suisse appelle l'Iran à s'abstenir de prononcer ou de mettre en œuvre des condamnations à mort en lien avec les manifestations. Engagée pour l'abolition mondiale de la peine de mort, elle appelle instamment l'Iran à en limiter l'usage aux crimes les plus graves. En outre, la Suisse rappelle l'importance particulière de la protection des minorités qui peuvent être exposées à des vulnérabilités accrues en période de tension. Madame la rapporteure spéciale, face à la situation actuelle, comment veiller à ce que la redevabilité pour les victimes de la répression des manifestations ne soit pas reléguée au second plan? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The situation in Iran and the region is incredibly volatile. We want a swift return to security and stability. We continue to support our Gulf allies in the face of Iran's reckless attacks. The Iranian authorities must not seek, as we have seen in the past, to exploit conflict to inflict further violence on its people. A renewed internet and communications shutdown prevents crucial communications and access to emergency services. As we saw in January, when the shutdown coincided with the most intense period of lethal force, Iranian authorities turn off internet access to cover up human rights violations. That brutal crackdown on protesters marked the most violent episode in Iran's history, and it is a history defined and sustained by state violence. Many thousands were killed. Thousands more were detained or disappeared. The full picture is not yet clear, which is why our support for evidence collection and accountability remains steadfast. As this conflict continues, we are mindful of women and girls and ethnic and religious minorities who are acutely vulnerable and who have faced severe repression since the Islamic Republic's inception. They, as all Iranian people, deserve to live in peace and security. Thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Slovenia aligns itself with the EU statement. We condemn the military escalation in the Middle East, including the use of force by the US and Israel, and Iran's retaliatory strikes across the region, which endanger the lives of civilians and risk serious consequences for international peace and security. Slovenia calls on all sides for an immediate de-escalation and restraint, and to respect international law and the UN Charter. We are afraid that the current conflict sets a dangerous modus operandi, further undermining the international order based on international law and respect for human rights. We emphasize the obligation of all parties to abide by the provisions of the international humanitarian law, to protect civilians and civilian infrastructure. Slovenia continues to support the Iranian people in their quest for dignity, respect for human rights and freedom. They should be the ones to decide upon their future. We call on Iranian authorities to cooperate fully with this Council, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and his office. In the light of recent civilian deaths, including children, does the FFM see possibilities to integrate protection norms under international humanitarian law, where applicable, into its investigative work on human rights abuses with Iran? I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Republic of Moldova.
Mr. Vice President, we thank the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for the presentations. Reports reveal that nationwide protests beginning of on December 28 last year triggered a state response marked by unprecedented level of violence, resulting in thousands killed, tens of thousands detained, including children and medical staff performing their duties. We strongly condemn the use of lethal force against the individuals exercising their fundamental rights. The internet shutdowns and the weaponization of digital infrastructure to suppress opposition are very concerning. We further condemn the sharp rise of executions in the last year, and at least 100 additional executions reported in January 26 alone. Persistent and structural discrimination against women, girls and minorities continued. We reiterate our call for accountability, immediate release of those arbitrarily detained, and a moratorium on executions as a first step towards the abolition of the death penalty. Mr. Vice President, developments in Iran and in the wider Middle East are of major concern. Search for diplomatic solutions while preventing further escalation leading to protracted conflict is of primary importance. We condemn the attacks that undermine the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the countries in the Middle East. We call for ensuring respect for international law, international humanitarian law, and most importantly, protection of civilian population. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Kingdom of the Netherlands.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. The Netherlands is deeply concerned about the ongoing escalation in the Middle East and urges the Islamic Republic of Iran to immediately cease its indiscriminate attacks across the wider region. We call on all parties to comply with international humanitarian law. Widespread human rights violations persist unabated in Iran. We strongly condemn the systematic oppression of women and girls, human rights defenders, LGBTIQ+ persons, and ethnic and religious minorities. We denounce the alarming number of executions, as well as Iran's practice of arbitrary detention and transnational repression. Respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms must be upheld at all times. We are alarmed that Iran has repeatedly shut down the internet this year and appeal to its government to uphold the freedom of expression, association, peaceful assembly, and to guarantee unrestricted access to information on the internet. Mr. Vice President, we underscore the urgent need for ongoing monitoring and ask that the fact-finding mission and the Special Rapporteur be provided with adequate resources and institutional support to carry out their work. We continue to urge the Islamic Republic of Iran to fully cooperate with both the Special Rapporteur and the FFM. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Romania.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Romania aligns with the EU statement. We support the mandates of the Council addressing the human rights situation in Iran. The Iranian authorities' reaction to peaceful demonstrations, legitimate economic grievances, and demands for equality and justice was brutal, disproportionate, and contrary to Iran's obligations to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms. All killings, all violence against peaceful protesters, and other human rights violations must be investigated in line with international human rights standards and those responsible held to account. We call on the government of Iran to cease all executions, immediately release all individuals detained solely for exercising the right to freedom of expression, peaceful assembly and association, and disclose the whereabouts and fate of all individuals detained or missing in connection with the protests. Romania expresses its solidarity with the Iranian people and commends their courage to fulfill their aspirations for a more democratic and just society. We encourage the Iranian civil society to continue their engagement for reform and pursue their legitimate aspirations for human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We would like to ask the mandate holders, how can this Council support such efforts? Last but not least, we stand in solidarity with our partners in the region, targeted by Iranian attacks, which profoundly affected regional stability and security. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Italy.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Italy aligns itself with the EU statement. We reiterate our support for the Special Rapporteur and the independent international fact-finding mission. Italy follows with deep concern the developments in Iran, where respect for international humanitarian and human rights law is now even more paramount, in particular the obligation to ensure the protection of civilians. We express our solidarity with the Iranian people in this terrible moment, who are already suffering as the human rights situation in the country continued to sharply deteriorate. Italy has long been deeply concerned about the systemic restriction on freedom of expression, persistent impunity and structural discrimination, particularly against women, girls and minorities. We urge once again the Iranian authorities to ensure accountability for human rights violations following the January protests, release of those arbitrarily detained, and guarantee fair trials. We condemn the sharp rise in executions and call upon Iran to establish a moratorium on the death penalty. Madam Special Rapporteur, how can independent monitoring and reliable reporting on the use of death penalty be ensured in absence of official data? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Burkina Faso.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Le Burkina Faso prend note des rapports du rapporteur spécial de la mission d'établissement des faits. Cette session du Conseil intervient dans un contexte international particulièrement préoccupant, marqué par une escalade de tensions et par des actions militaires israélo-américaines intervenues depuis le 28 février 2026 contre la République islamique d'Iran, ainsi que par les réactions qu'elles ont suscitées. Ces développements ont entraîné des pertes en vies humaines et d'importantes destructions d'infrastructures civiles. Ils soulignent une fois de plus la nécessité impérieuse de préserver l'ordre juridique international et de renforcer le respect des principes fondamentaux consacrés par la Charte des Nations Unies. À cet égard, ma délégation tient à rappeler que le respect de la souveraineté des États, de leur intégrité territoriale et du principe de non-ingérence dans les affaires intérieures constitue le socle indispensable des relations internationales pacifiques et équilibrées. Le Burkina Faso demeure profondément attaché à la promotion et la protection des droits de l'homme dans leur universalité et leur indivisibilité. Aussi, ma délégation estime que le Conseil des droits de l'homme doit continuer à promouvoir une approche fondée sur le dialogue constructif, la coopération internationale et l'objectivité et la non-sélectivité. Pour terminer, ma délégation appelle à la désescalade des tensions et à la relance des voies diplomatiques, seules à même de préserver la paix et la stabilité.
I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Yemen.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. اطلع وفد بلادي باهتمام بالغ على تقرير المقرر الخاص وتقرير لجنة تقصي الحقائق الدولية حول وضع حقوق الإنسان في الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية وما تضمناه من انتهاكات ممنهجة وموثقة لحقوق الإنسان. وفي هذا السياق نؤكد أن إيران تمارس منذ عقود تدخلات خطيرة ومرفوضة في شؤون اليمن من خلال دعم ميليشيات الحوثي الانقلابية الإرهابية بأسلحة نوعية وخبراء في التسليح والقمع وتشجيعها لاستنساخ الانتهاكات الخطيرة ضد المدنيين والصحفيين والمدافعين عن حقوق الإنسان والنساء والأطفال، بما في ذلك الاعتقال التعسفي والتعذيب والإخفاء القسري والقتل خارج القانون، ناهيك عن الاعتداء على الموظفين الأمميين وتهديد دول الجوار والملاحة الدولية. ونسجل هنا إدانتنا الشديدة للاعتداءات الإيرانية المتكررة وغير المبررة على الدول الخليجية والعربية الشقيقة واستهدافها للمنشآت المدنية والبنى التحتية الحيوية ومحاولة جر المنطقة إلى حرب بيئية شاملة. وختاما نؤكد على أن المجتمع الدولي مطالب بالتحرك الفوري لفرض احترام القانون الدولي واحترام سيادة الدول وحماية شعوب المنطقة من تفاقم العنف. وشكرا.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I thank the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for the continued efforts to address the situation. The peace and stability of the Middle East is of utmost importance to Japan. As a country that respects fundamental values and principles such as freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, Japan will continue to make all necessary diplomatic efforts in coordination with the international community to bring about an early de-escalation of the situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Japan opposes any use of force against peaceful protests and attacks on civic space in the country. We urge Iran to uphold the human rights of all individuals, in particular the right to freedom of expression, including freedom to seek, receive, and impart information, and the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association without fear of reprisal or intimidation. Japan remains open to dialogue with Iran to further exchange views on efforts to improve its human rights situations, including through a bilateral human rights dialogue. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Austria.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Austria aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for their reports. We are deeply concerned by their findings, which include the killings of thousands of people since the eruption of the protests, the reported arrest of over 50,000 people, including children, women, minorities, journalists, medical workers, and human rights defenders, and the reports on critical conditions in detention facilities, the application of the death penalty in relation to the protests, with at least 30 individuals, including 2 children, reportedly facing execution, the nationwide telecommunications shutdown with internet connectivity reportedly collapsing to approximately 1% of normal levels, the disproportionate negative effects and targeting of ethnic and religious minorities, notably the Baha'i. Those responsible for these grave human rights violations must be held accountable and evidence preserved. In this light, Austria has supported the designation of the IRGC as a terrorist organization. Austria condemns Iran's strikes across the region and indiscriminate attacks against civilian targets in Israel. We urge all parties to the conflict to adhere to international humanitarian and human rights law. Protection of all civilians, particularly women and children, must remain a key priority. Austria calls for immediate de-escalation and cessation of hostilities of all parties involved and return to diplomatic avenues. Vienna stands ready to serve as a venue for negotiations. The Iranian people deserve freedom and the right to determine their own democratic future. I thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Oman.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. يأتي عقد هذا الحوار التفاعلي المشترك في ظل سياق إقليمي ودولي دقيق، حيث تشهد المنطقة تطورات مقلقة نتيجة تصاعد الأعمال العسكرية وتبادل الهجمات، الأمر الذي ينذر بتداعيات خطيرة تمس سيادة الدول وأمنها واستقرار شعوبها، كما ينعكس سلبا على أوضاع حقوق الإنسان وحماية المدنيين. وتجدد سلطنة عمان من هذا المنبر إدانتها لكافة الاعتداءات والهجمات التي تستهدف الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية، وتعرب كذلك عن رفضها القاطع وإدانتها لاستهداف أراضي دول مجلس التعاون لدول الخليج العربية والدول العربية، وتدعو جميع الأطراف المعنية إلى ضبط النفس ووقف الأعمال العدائية والالتزام بمبادئ القانون الدولي وتجنب استهداف المدنيين والمنشآت الحيوية والبنية التحتية. وتؤكد سلطنة عمان أهمية تكثيف الجهود الإقليمية والدولية الهادفة إلى وقف الحرب والعودة إلى طاولة المفاوضات واعتماد الحلول الدبلوماسية باعتبارها المسار الأنجع لمعالجة جذور الأزمات وتعزيز الأمن والاستقرار، ومن شأن ذلك أن يهيئ الظروف الملائمة لمواصلة الجهود الرامية لتعزيز وحماية حقوق الإنسان على جميع المستويات، سواء في الجمهورية الإسلامية الإيرانية أو في سائر الدول في المنطقة والعالم. وشكرا.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Argentina.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. El informe presentado ante este Consejo describe una realidad que no se puede ignorar. Documenta ejecuciones, detenciones arbitrarias y una represión violenta contra ciudadanos que ejercían un derecho elemental, el derecho a expresar sus ideas y reclamar libertad. Estamos hablando de incidentes aislados, estamos hablando de vidas humanas, de hombres y mujeres que salieron a las calles con palabras, con esperanza, con dignidad y encontraron balas. El informe habla de la muerte de innumerables ciudadanos a manos de las mismas autoridades que debían protegerlos, y cada una de esas muertes nos interpela, porque esos ciudadanos no eran enemigos del Estado, eran su propio pueblo, no eran agitadores, eran hijos, hijas, madres y padres. Y hoy debemos decirlo con claridad ante este Consejo: esas vidas no fueron en vano. Se trata de verdaderos héroes, héroes porque cuando miles de ciudadanos están dispuestos a entregar su propia vida, la tragedia se convierte en un testimonio inmenso de la dignidad humana. Héroes también porque comprendieron que para el ser humano hay algo más valioso que el petróleo, más valioso que el oro o que el dinero, más valioso que cualquier riqueza material. Héroes porque la historia ha demostrado una y otra vez que ese valor tiene una fuerza que ningún ejército ni la represión más dura nunca ha logrado derrotar. Héroes porque comprendieron y nos enseñaron que en lo más alto está el valor de la libertad. Muchas gracias, señor vicepresidente.
Thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sri Lanka.
Mr. Vice President, we reiterate our principled position against country-specific initiatives introduced without taking into consideration the overall circumstances. Mr. Vice President, Sri Lanka is deeply concerned by the rapidly escalating situation in the Middle East and West Asia, which poses a direct threat to the civilian population. We are saddened by the tragic loss of civilian life and condemn any attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure. Sri Lanka underscores the protection of civilians on all sides is a fundamental obligation under international humanitarian law. We stand firmly in our commitment to the sanctity of human life and upholding global peace. Sri Lanka reiterates the need to respect the principles and purposes of the UN Charter, which prohibit the use of force against the territorial integrity or the political independence of any state. As a country firmly committed to the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states, Sri Lanka calls on all parties to respect these age-old principles, to exercise maximum restraint, and to return to negotiations to prevent further aggravation of this dire situation. We urge all parties to engage in meaningful dialogue and take decisive action to further de-escalate tensions, given the serious threat posed to stability, peace, security in the region and beyond. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Belarus.
Спасибо, господин заместитель председателя. Проведение в СПЧ дискуссии по ситуации с правами человека в Иране на фоне отсутствия реакции Совета на неспровоцированную вооруженную агрессию против этой страны повлекшую масштабные жертвы среди мирного населения, включая детей, это не только двойные стандарты. Это глубочайшая деградация гуманности и уважения права на жизнь. Многие годы права человека использовались как предлог для санкционного прессинга на Иран, нанесения ущерба усилиям правительства по укреплению социальных и экономических прав населения. Вместо диалога и сотрудничества, осуждения односторонних принудительных мер, в СПЧ принимались неконсенсусные резолюции и множились политизированные механизмы по Ирану для продвижения интересов их инициаторов. Эти механизмы игнорировали позицию государства, не желали признавать очевидные различия между мирными протестами и противоправными экстремистскими действиями. За неудавшимися попытками дестабилизировать Иран и сменить власть через подпитываемые извне протесты последовала вооруженная агрессия, ужасающие последствия которой для мирного населения всего региона очевидны и продолжают возрастать. Требуется скорейшая деэскалация конфликта, который несет человеческие жертвы и разрушения по всему региону. Благодарю.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malta.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malta aligns itself with the statement by the European Union and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. Special Rapporteur, your report presents a stark picture of violations targeting persons exercising their right of peaceful protest that include violations of medical neutrality. The citizens of Iran were also forced to endure days of internet and communications shutdown, arbitrary arrests, and severe crackdowns by security forces. We call on Iran to immediately release all persons detained for exercising their basic human rights. The fact-finding mission report paints a converging picture of systematic state action intended to suppress basic freedoms. Of particular concern is the application of the death penalty on dubious charges and without due process. Women and girls continue to face severe harassment as rules on wearing a hijab were strictly enforced, as well as labelling non-conformists as enemies. Your determination that threats to women's right to life is a foreseeable outcome of a legal system that fundamentally discriminates against women and girls is shocking. We call upon Iran to implement its human rights obligations without delay. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Liechtenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Liechtenstein thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their respective reports. We are deeply concerned by the military escalation in the wider Middle East and call for immediate de-escalation by the conflict parties in order to ensure the protection of civilians and stability in the region. Liechtenstein has over many years supported diplomacy as the primary route of engagement between the parties to the conflict. We are particularly shocked by the attack against the girls' primary school in Minab, resulting in the killing of at least 165 schoolgirls and injuring many more. We welcome the announcement by the United States to launch an investigation into the attack. Mr. Vice President, we continue to be gravely concerned about the human rights situation in Iran, particularly the crackdown of the protests that began in late December, resulting in the death of thousands of persons, including children, and many more arbitrarily detained. We deplore the sharp rise of executions, the serious and ongoing human rights violations, the severe restrictions of fundamental freedoms, the persistent impunity, and the lack of cooperation by the Iranian authorities with your mandates. The attacks by the Iranian authorities against their own civilian population amount to crimes against humanity, and the perpetrators need to be held accountable. The people of Iran deserve to freely determine their political future in accordance with their right to self-determination. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Czechia.
Mr. Vice President, the Czech Republic aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their reports. The repeated use of lethal force against peaceful protesters, widespread internet shutdown during periods of unrest, and the absence of accountability point to long-standing systematic violations of human rights. We are alarmed by the high number of people killed during the January protests and by the widespread arbitrary detention of individuals who peacefully expressed legitimate grievances. Reports of their forced confessions, along with deliberate obstruction of access to information, further exacerbate the crisis. The Czech Republic urges the Iranian authorities to immediately halt the use of force, release all those detained for exercising their fundamental rights, and restore unrestricted access to Internet. We urge Iran to meet its international human rights obligations and to take credible steps toward justice and protection of fundamental freedoms. We reaffirm our solidarity with the people of Iran and encourage the authorities to cooperate fully with this Council, including by granting unhindered access to both mandates. Madam Special Rapporteur, members of the FFM, considering the systemic patterns you have documented, what would be the most effective measures this Council could take to support and protect those at risk in Iran? I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. For 15 years, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been subjected to a selective, politically motivated and confrontational country-specific mandate within the Human Rights Council. The so-called fact-finding mission was established through a hostile process during the 35th special session of the Council, following intensive lobbying and political maneuvering by a number of Western countries. The reports produced under this mandate are compiled in an unprofessional manner and reflect the political objectives of some Western countries, which have a pattern of using self-efficient human rights mechanisms to conceal their ulterior motives. Abuse of UN human rights mechanisms to single out and harass states that do not conform to the hegemonic and geopolitical interests of the West constitutes a grave violation of fundamental principles of respecting sovereignty and non-interference in the internal affairs of states, as enshrined in the UN Charter. We urge the HRC and OHCHR to encourage genuine dialogue and cooperation with states, carry out their work in an objective and impartial manner, and to stand firmly against the politicization, selectivity, and double standards of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Luxembourg.
Monsieur le Vice-président, le Luxembourg souscrit à la déclaration de l'Union européenne. Madame la rapporteure spéciale, Madame la présidente de la mission d'établissement des faits, nous tenons à vous remercier pour la présentation de vos rapports. Ils permettent de mieux appréhender la situation des droits humains en Iran. Le Luxembourg est profondément préoccupé par l'escalade militaire sans précédent au Moyen-Orient et nos pensées vont aux familles des victimes. La rapporteure spéciale met en lumière une situation des droits humains en Iran marquée par une forte recrudescence de la répression depuis les manifestations de décembre 2025. Il est fait mention d'un recours systématique à la force, d'arrestations arbitraires, de la large suppression des télécommunications et de graves violations de la neutralité médicale. Le rapport souligne aussi une aggravation de la situation depuis les premières frappes fin février et début mars qui ont depuis développé une envergure quasi globale. Nous soutenons fermement votre appel à garantir la protection des civils. Nous appelons également le gouvernement iranien à rétablir l'accès à l'information et à veiller à ce que ses obligations en matière des droits humains restent pleinement respectées, indépendamment des dynamiques régionales et militaires actuelles. Face à la coupure de la connexion Internet et des télécommunications téléphoniques, comment est-ce que votre mission est encore capable de poursuivre son important travail et d'assurer à ce que les violations des droits humains ne soient pas perdues de vue? Je vous remercie.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Montenegro.
Vice President, Montenegro acknowledged the vital work and insights of the Special Rapporteur and fact-finding mission. Their reports highlight the Iranian people's deepening plight, exacerbated by increasing hostilities within the country and across the region. This situation underscores the urgent need to protect all civilians, uphold international law, and abide by the principles of the UN Charter. The findings detail unprecedented repression during nationwide peaceful protests, with thousands killed and tens of thousands arbitrarily detained. The documented violations, including murder, imprisonment, torture, sexual violence, gender persecution, and enforced disappearance, may amount to crimes against humanity. This reflects a system that criminalizes dissent, entrenches impunity, and denies victims their rights. We strongly condemn the use of the death penalty, with a staggering over 1,600 executions in 2025 alone. This is particularly concerning for women and those charged under the new espionage law. We call for a moratorium on execution, leading to their abolition. We also condemn the targeting of human rights defenders, journalists and protest witnesses, including through acts of transnational repression. We urge Iranian authorities to end violence, release all those arbitrarily detained, and respect fundamental freedoms. Accountability is indispensable for justice and prevention of future violence. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Qatar.
سيد نائب الرئيس، تدين دولة قطر بأشد العبارات الاعتداءات الإيرانية التي أشار إليها التقرير والتي استهدفت الأراضي القطرية وعددا من الدول الشقيقة في انتهاك صارخ للسيادة الوطنية وتهديد مباشر لأمن وسلامة المدنيين وخرق واضح للقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة وتصعيد مرفوض يهدد أمن واستقرار المنطقة. نرحب باعتماد مجلس الأمن لقرار 2817 الذي يدين الهجمات الإيرانية على عدد من دول المنطقة ويؤكد احترام سيادة الدول وسلامة أراضيها ورفض استهدام المدنيين والمنشآت الحيوية. إن استهداف دولة ليست طرفا في النزاع ولم تسمح باستخدام أراضيها أو أجواءها في الأعمال القتالية يمثل انتهاكا خطيرا للقانون الدولي ويؤثر سلبا على السلم والأمن الدوليين والتمتع بالحقوق الأساسية وفي مقدمتها الحق في الحياة والتعليم والصحة والأمن والتنمية. ونرفض ما ورد في تقريري المفوض الخاص وبعثة تقصي الحقائق الدولية من توصيف لهذه الهجمات بأنها ضربات انتقامية فضلا عن غياب أي إدانة واضحة لها. إن مثل هذا التوصيف يفتقر إلى أي أساس قانوني أو واقعي من شأنه أن يضفي شرعية على أعمال عدوانية تعد غير مشروعة بكل وضوح بموجب القانون الدولي. في الختام تؤكد بلادي احتفاظها بحقها الكامل في الرد وفقا للمادة 51 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة دفاعا عن سيادتها وصونا لأمنها وتجدد الدعوة إلى الوقف الفوري للتصعيد والعودة إلى الحوار وتقريب الحكمة بما يحفظ أمن واستقرار المنطقة. شكرا.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Spain.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. España se suma a la declaración de la Unión Europea y agradece los informes presentados. Ante la gravedad de los acontecimientos a los que asistimos, consideramos doblemente importante el diálogo que está teniendo lugar hoy, porque este Consejo debe defender el derecho internacional en todas las circunstancias con igual intensidad. España sigue con gran preocupación la grave situación de derechos humanos en Irán, el aumento en la aplicación de la pena de muerte, la restricción de las libertades civiles y la persecución de todas las minorías que los informes documentan. La represión ejercida por las autoridades iraníes contra los manifestantes pacíficos a inicios de año, así como las detenciones arbitrarias y las sentencias sumarias de ejecuciones de estos manifestantes, son gravísimas violaciones del derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. Tampoco consideramos aceptables las restricciones a las comunicaciones y nos alarma el uso de los hospitales y servicios médicos como un instrumento de represión y control. España también condena enérgicamente la violencia y represión ejercida en Irán contra las mujeres, cuyos derechos fundamentales son violados de manera sistemática y cuyas protestas han sido violentamente silenciadas. Irán es el país de Masha Amini, no lo olvidamos, y también de las niñas víctimas del bombardeo de la escuela de Minab. Ante la guerra, España rechaza las acciones unilaterales de Estados Unidos e Israel. Condenamos los ataques indiscriminados de Irán a los países vecinos y pedimos el cese inmediato de los mismos. Debemos regresar al derecho internacional. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Colombia ve con preocupación el deterioro. Hace pocos meses presenciábamos el nivel sin precedentes de represión de las protestas populares y ahora el uso de la fuerza contra Irán, como se señala en el informe de la misión de investigación y en las manifestaciones de la relatora especial, lo cual ha dejado a la población iraní atrapada entre una campaña militar a gran escala y un aparato nacional responsable de violaciones a los derechos humanos. Colombia ve con preocupación el deterioro aún mayor de la difícil situación de los derechos humanos en Irán, a consecuencia de los recientes ataques armados contra ese país. Esto ha desencadenado a su vez acciones armadas iraníes contra los estados de la región, con consecuencias igualmente perturbadoras, particularmente frente a la población civil. Colombia no puede permanecer en silencio ante el costo humano de la situación en Irán y en la región. No se puede continuar exponiendo a comunidades enteras al miedo y al riesgo, lo que dificulta la situación de los más vulnerables, las mujeres y los niños. Ningún objetivo militar puede justificar que la población civil quede atrapada en el fuego cruzado o sea víctima de ataques indiscriminados, particularmente frente a instalaciones protegidas por el derecho internacional humanitario, como las escuelas. La protección de la vida debe ser nuestra máxima prioridad. Debe cesar el uso de la fuerza por parte de todos los involucrados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Arab Emirates.
السيد نائب الرئيس، مع مرور 17 يوما على الهجمات الإيرانية الغادرة على بلادي، ما يزال العالم يطالب من خلال قرار مجلس الأمن 28/17 بالوقف الفوري لهذه الأعمال العدوانية. نعبر عن رفضنا القاطع لأي مبررات صدرت من إيران بشأن التصعيد العدواني، فما هي إلا محاولات نشر الأكاذيب وتضليل المجتمع الدولي لتبرير اعتداءاتها السافرة على دولة الإمارات والمنطقة. رغم أن دولة الإمارات بذلت حتى اللحظة الأخيرة جهودا صادقة ومسؤولة لتجنب اندلاع الحرب، فإن إيران هي من عزلت نفسها عن جيرانها. وفي هذا الصدد ترفض بلادي بشكل قاطع ما ورد في تقرير المقررة الخاصة وبعثة تقصي الحقائق من توصيف لهذه الهجمات بأنها ضربات انتقامية، فهذا التوصيف يفتقر إلى أي أساس قانوني أو واقعي، ويمنح غطاء غير مبرر لأعمال عدوانية غير مشروعة بموجب القانون الدولي. إن الهجمات الإيرانية على بلادي تمثل انتهاكا خطيرا لحقوق الإنسان وعدوانا غير مبرر، رغم أن بلادي ليست طرفا في النزاع، وقد استهدفت هذه الهجمات المدنيين والبنية التحتية المدنية التي أسفرت عن وفيات وإصابات في انتهاك صارخ لسيادة الدولة ولمبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي. تؤكد دولة الإمارات أن لها الحق الأصيل في الدفاع عن النفس وفقا للقانون الدولي وميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وشكرا السيد نائب الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Vice President. Ireland aligns with the EU statement and thanks the Special Rapporteur and fact-finding mission for their reports, which clearly demonstrate the need for continued monitoring of the human rights situation in Iran, notwithstanding the challenges in doing so at present. Ireland has consistently condemned the Iranian authorities for their violations of human rights, discrimination against women and girls, and the oppression of minority groups in Iran, including the Baha'i and other minority faiths, as documented in the reports, is of particular concern to Ireland. The continued and extensive use of the death penalty in Iran should cease immediately. Ireland reiterates its condemnation of the recent brutal repression of protesters, including the reported deaths of at least 7,000 Iranians and the arbitrary detention of tens of thousands. Iranians should be free to express their views without the fear of violence. Ireland calls on the Iranian authorities to halt all violence, suspend executions and release those who have been detained. Vice President, Ireland recalls that all parties in any conflict must meet their obligations in full under international law, including international humanitarian law. Civilians and civilian infrastructure must not be targeted and must be protected. Special Rapporteur, what is your assessment of the potential to strengthen monitoring of the human rights situation in Iran, given the challenges that obtain? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Uzbekistan via video.
Thank you, Chair. The delegation of Uzbekistan notes our country's commitment to an open and respectful dialogue with the United Nations human rights mechanisms, as well as to constructive engagement with all member states. We believe it is important that discussions of human rights issues within the Human Rights Council be conducted in a spirit of objectivity, mutual respect, and impartiality. In this regard, we consider it is necessary to refrain from the politicization of human rights agenda and to use Council's potential primarily to strengthen trust and promote constructive international cooperation. Uzbekistan firmly supports the settlement of any agreements and disputes exclusively through peaceful means on the basis of norms and principles of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. We emphasize the unwavering commitment of Uzbekistan to the principles of the sovereign equality of the states, respect for their independence and territorial integrity, and the non-use of force or threat of force in the international relations, as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ukraine.
Mr. Vice President, Ukraine thanks the Special Rapporteur and the fact-finding mission for their important work in documenting widespread, systematic and persistent human rights violations in Iran. The Iranian authorities, which have been mocking the Iranian people for decades, has launched a large-scale policy of violence against its own people and other countries. This includes massive human rights violations within the country, support for militants who have brought chaos to other countries in the region, and direct military support for the aggressor state of Russia in its unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We remember and will never forget the strikes of thousands of shaheeds on our peaceful cities and people. Such cooperation between Moscow and Tehran results in a gross violation of international law and undermines global efforts to restore peace and stability. We confirm the unchanged position of our state. We support the Iranian people and their legitimate desire to live in security, freedom and prosperity. We therefore call on Iran to cease its involvement in Russia's war crimes, uphold its international obligations, and grant full, unrestricted access to the UN Human Rights Special Procedures mandate holders, and fully cooperate with the independent international fact-finding mission. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Zimbabwe.
Vice President, Zimbabwe is worried by the continued politicization of the Human Rights Council and the use of double standards. The current situation in Iran calls for condemnation, yet the Council has remained mum when the territorial integrity of Iran is being violated and civilian infrastructure and innocent people being targeted. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to the principles enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, including respect for sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of states, and the fundamental principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of all countries. Iran has remained steadfast in its commitment to effectively address the social and economic needs of its citizens in safeguarding the human rights of its people through continued cooperation with the Human Rights Council and other human rights mechanisms. The continuation of the fact-finding mission without the consent of the government of Iran is not only costly but counterproductive in terms of encouraging and supporting the country to effectively meet its human rights obligation. We urge the Council to pursue a path of constructive dialogue and cooperation with the government of Iran. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Vicepresidente, Cuba reitera su rechazo a los mandatos punitivos y parcializados que se establecen contra la voluntad del Estado concernido, como es el caso de Irán, y que han demostrado por años ser inefectivos en la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Esos mecanismos injerencistas que se imponen año tras año contra determinados países, que siempre son del sur, en lugar de contribuir a la causa de los derechos humanos, se convierten en un obstáculo para el diálogo respetuoso y la cooperación genuina. Cuba condena firmemente la agresión de los Estados Unidos e Israel contra Irán. Abogamos por el respeto al derecho internacional, la soberanía e integridad territorial de Irán y de todas las naciones de la región, y el cese de los actos que ocasionan daños humanos y a la infraestructura civil de Irán y los Estados árabes. Reiteramos el llamado a preservar el principio de buena vecindad, la moderación y el diálogo en este delicado momento. Las medidas coercitivas unilaterales impuestas desde hace décadas han afectado la vida del pueblo iraní y violan sus derechos humanos. Cuba reitera su rechazo a esas medidas y demanda su eliminación. Seguiremos abogando por la promoción de los derechos humanos en cualquier país sobre la base del diálogo y la cooperación basados en la imparcialidad, el respeto y la no injerencia. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Chile.
Gracias, señor vicepresidente. Chile agradece los informes del relator especial y de la Misión Internacional Independiente de Investigación. Sus conclusiones reflejan la gravedad de la situación de derechos humanos en la República Islámica de Irán y el profundo impacto humano que continúa generando. Los informes documentan hechos profundamente preocupantes. uso excesivo de la fuerza contra manifestantes, detenciones arbitrarias, incremento sostenido de ejecuciones y crecientes restricciones al espacio cívico. Resultan igualmente alarmantes las denuncias sobre ataques a hospitales y la persecución de personal médico, en contravención de principios esenciales del derecho internacional humanitario y de los derechos humanos. Chile reafirma su compromiso con la promoción universal de los derechos humanos. La estabilidad y el desarrollo de las sociedades se fortalecen cuando se garantizan las libertades fundamentales, se protege el espacio cívico y se escucha a la ciudadanía. Reiteramos la importancia de investigaciones independientes, imparciales y transparentes que permitan esclarecer los hechos, garantizar el acceso a la verdad, la justicia y la reparación para las víctimas y fortalecer la confianza en las instituciones. Quisiéramos preguntar a la misión y al relator, ¿qué medidas consideran prioritarias para reforzar la protección de las víctimas y asegurar que las pruebas recopiladas puedan contribuir a futuros procesos de rendición de cuentas? Muchas gracias.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ghana.
Mr. Vice President, Ghana thanks the Special Rapporteur and the FFM for the report on the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. We are concerned about reports of serious human rights violations, including excessive use of force against protesters, arbitrary arrests, allegations of unlawful killings, torture and ill treatment, as well as restrictions on access to information. Mr. Vice President, Ghana is equally concerned by the rapidly deteriorating security situation in the region and calls on all parties to exercise maximum restraint, cease hostilities and prioritize dialogue and diplomacy as the only sustainable path towards de-escalation and regional stability. We call on all states to fulfill their obligations under international human rights law, including the protection of the rights to life, peaceful assembly, freedom of expression, and protection of civilians and civilian infrastructure. We further encourage constructive engagement between the government of Iran and the FFM and Special Rapporteur. We also call on Iran to facilitate access to the country. Ghana remains committed to supporting dialogue, accountability, and the protection of human rights of all people. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Sudan.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. كدولة عانت وتعاني من تبعات وآثار النزاعات وتدرك تماما آلامها، ننتهز هذه السانحة للدعوة لتهدئة المواجهات في الخليج والشرق الأوسط والعودة إلى طاولة التفاوض وحل النزاع الجاري بالسبل السلمية والقانون الدولي، فكل نقاط الاختلاف قابلة للحل. إن هذا النزاع الذي يجري في واحدة من أكثر المناطق حساسية في العالم سيلقي بتبعات سلبية على كل السلم والأمن الدوليين وعلى الاقتصاد وعلى التمتع بحقوق الإنسان إقليميا ودوليا. ندعو مجلس الأمن للاطلاع بمسؤولياته وحل النزاع وفق مرجعيات القانون الدولي، ونشير إلى خطورة توسيع دائرة المواجهات، كما ندعو إلى الالتزام بمعايير القانون الدولي الإنساني والامتناع عن استهداف الأعيان المدنية. لقد أخذنا علما بمحتويات التقريرين المقدمين وما جاء فيهما من ملاحظات وتوصيات، ونشجع إيران على مواصلة مجهوداتها في مجالات ترقية وحماية حقوق الإنسان، بما في ذلك في جوانب الإصلاح القانوني وحماية الفئات الأضعف وتقديم الخدمات الاجتماعية وحماية الحيز المدني. شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Greece aligns itself with the EU statement and thanks the SR and the FFM for their reports. We are deeply concerned by the continued deterioration of the human rights situation in Iran. The unprecedented violence against peaceful protesters since 28 December 2025, resulting in thousands of civilian deaths, is shocking and unacceptable. Reports of accelerated trials and severe penalties, including the death penalty against protesters, are equally alarming and further silence legitimate voices. Religious and ethnic minorities continue to face discrimination, arbitrary detention, and unfair trials, while women and girls experience persistent structural inequalities. Restrictions on communications and internet access further aggravate the situation by limiting the free flow of information and hindering independent scrutiny. Credible investigations and accountability for those responsible are essential. Greece supports international efforts to document abuses in the work of civil society and human rights defenders operating under extremely difficult conditions. Greece also condemns Iranian strikes against neighboring countries and stresses the need for maximum restraint, de-escalation, and full respect for international law. Lasting solutions can only be achieved through dialogue that addresses legitimate concerns, reduces the risk of further violence, and paves the way for a peaceful and dignified future for the Iranian people, while safeguarding international security. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Afghanistan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. We expressed our profound concern and condemn the recent aggressions and military strikes against Iran and the expansion of the war in the GCC regions and beyond, which is a clear breach of international law. Such aggressions undermines the UN Charter, the principles of sovereign equality, the prohibition on the use of force, and the peaceful settlement of disputes. We recall that even in moments of crisis, all parties remain bound by international humanitarian law and international human rights law, including the obligation to protect civilians and civilian objects at all times. There can be no justification for deliberate or indiscriminate attacks on schools, hospitals, or other essential civilian infrastructure. Mr. Vice President, we also express concern that this escalation further endangers refugees and migrants from Afghanistan and Iran, who already face forced returns, insecurity, and protection risk. We reaffirm that force cannot be substituted for diplomacy and urge all parties to exercise restraint, return to meaningful negotiation, and uphold the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, and international human rights law. I thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Eritrea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Today's session is being held on the backdrop of the tragic developments unfolding in the Middle East and blatant violations of the UN Charter and international law, including the core objectives of protecting and promoting human rights and humanitarian law. While categorically condemning all attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure, as well as the use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, we urge for the immediate cessation of hostilities. We express our deepest sympathy and solidarity for the loss of all innocent civilians killed by the military attacks, including the young schoolgirls in Minab. Last year, the mandate under consideration had undergone through an unusual renewal procedure, followed by a special session earlier this year, further complicating the mandate that has already been highly politicized. In this dialogue, we would like to focus on the decisions that would emerge from this Council. It is essential that the Council exercises sensible judgment and upholds a strong moral responsibility and avoid divisive approaches in its decision-making. Selectively targeting certain states that are already facing multiple politically driven pressures risks deepening divisions. We remain concerned about the recurring practices within the Council, including the role played by certain actors in advancing confrontational approaches. Eritrea encourages the Council to refrain from practices that isolate states and calls for fairness and balance in carrying out its work. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of China.
副主席先生，中方注意到有关报告。 对报告基于虚假和片面信息干涉主权国家内政表示关切。中方欢迎伊政府近年来在促进和保护人权，特别是妇女、儿童、少数群体、难移民权利方面所作努力。中方一贯反对未经当事国同意强行设立国别机制，反对将人权问题政治化、工具化，呼吁国际社会切实尊重伊朗主权。 客观、公正、全面看待伊朗人权状况。中方严重关切个别国家未经联合国授权，在谈判期间对伊发动武力袭击，导致战事外溢，波及周边国家，明显违反国际法。这些行径严重侵犯人民生存权、发展权等基本权利。中方谴责所有针对平民和民用设施的袭击。 呼吁各方立即停止军事行动，尽快重回对话谈判。谢谢副主席。
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Kuwait.
سيد نائب الرئيس، يضم وفد بلادي صوته إلى ما جاء في بيان دول مجلس التعاون الخليجي، ويجدد إدانته بأشد العبارات الهجوم الإيراني الآثم الذي استهدف أراضي ومدني دولة الكويت ودول المنطقة في خرق واضح لكافة المواثيق والقوانين الدولية ذات الصلة. السيد الرئيس، لا يسعني من هذا المنبر إلا أن أرفع أسمى آيات التعازي والمواساة للشهداء من أبناء وطني ودول المنطقة جراء هذا الهجوم السافر، ونجدد هنا على حقنا الأصيل بالدفاع عن النفس بموجب المادة 51 من ميثاق الأمم المتحدة، فإن أي تهديد أو اعتداء يستهدف إحدى دولنا يعد تهديدا لأمننا الجماعي وتصعيدا غير مبرر ومرفوض. السيد الرئيس، اعتمد مجلس الأمن قراره رقم 2817 تأكيدا للجريمة التي تقوم بها إيران ضد دول المنطقة، والذي أدان فيها بأشد العبارات الهجمات الإيرانية عليها، وأكد على احترام سيادة الدول ورفض استهداف المدنيين. السيد الرئيس، ترفض بلادي ما جاء في تقرير المقرر الخاص وبعثة تقصي الحقائق الدولية بوصف الهجمات الإيرانية بأنها ضربات انتقامية في غياب تام عن أي إدانة واضحة لها، والذي من شأنه أن يضفي شرعية لهذه الأعمال العدائية غير المبررة وغير المشروعة. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, крайне обеспокоены складывающейся вокруг Ирана ситуацией. Предпринятые США и Израилем действия являются очередным, неспровоцированным актом вооруженной агрессии против суверенного и независимого государства-члена ООН в нарушении ее устава и основополагающих принципов международного права. Они неприкрыто направлены на дальнейшее вмешательство во внутренние дела Ирана и уничтожение этого неудобного Западу государства. Безответный шаг Вашингтона и Западного Иерусалима уже привел к резким эскалации ситуации во всем регионе и рискует обернуться гуманитарной и экономической катастрофой. На этом фоне совершенно безосновательны попытки западных стран оправдать агрессию в отношении Ирана некими мнимыми угрозами международному миру и безопасности. Призываем США и Израиль немедленно прекратить свои агрессивные действия, настаиваем на незамедлительном возобновлении политико-дипломатического урегулирования ситуации на основе международного права, взаимного уважения и баланса интересов. Категорически осуждаем попытки политизации правозащитной проблематики, ставшей в руках коллективного Запада инструментом давления на государства, не желающих идти по навязанному ими извне курсу. На примере Ирана видно, как по псевдогуманистическим предлогам западные страны последовательно следуют данному опробированному ими курсу на дестабилизацию обстановки в неугодных для них государствах. Исходим из того, что навешивание ярлыков по политическим мотивам дискредитирует органы ООН, включая ее Совет по правам человека. Призываем отказаться от этой порочной практики. Благодарю за внимание.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Vice President, Ethiopia believes that multilateral forums, including this Council, play a vital role in fostering cooperation among states in fulfilling their human rights obligations. In this regard, we emphasize the importance of constructive engagement, dialogue, and mutual understanding in advancing the promotion and protection of human rights globally. Ethiopia acknowledges the engagement of Islamic Republic of Iran with international human rights mechanisms. In this respect, we encourage Iran to continue its cooperation with relevant mechanisms, including the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as its constructive participation in the Universal Periodic Review process and the implementation of accepted recommendations. Ethiopia remains firmly committed to the principle of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the work of this Council. In closing, Ethiopia underscores that enhanced cooperation with the states, support for nationally led initiatives, and the promotion of constructive dialogue, technical assistance, and capacity building undertaken with the consent of the concerned state are essential for sustainable promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Malaysia thanks the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for their continued work. Malaysia remains deeply concerned by reports of attacks on civilian infrastructures, including the strikes on the girls' schools in Minap. Attacks on schools are particularly alarming and must be unequivocally condemned. schools are civilian objects and must never become targets of violence. The protection of civilians, especially children, must remain paramount at all times. Educational institutions represent more than physical infrastructure. They are essential spaces that safeguard children's right to education and their future. When schools are damaged or destroyed, the consequences extend far beyond the immediate loss of life, undermining stability, recovery, and the long-term well-being of affected communities. Malaysia therefore underscores the importance of full respect for international law, including international humanitarian law, particularly the principles of distinction and protection of civilian objects. In this regard, Malaysia encourages the Special Rapporteur and the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission to closely examine allegations of attacks against civilian infrastructure and their implications for the enjoyment of human rights, particularly the rights of children, and to ensure that the findings are duly reflected in its forthcoming report. Accountability and credible documentation remain essential to ensuring protection for civilians, including children, and preventing further violations of human rights. Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Niger. I believe the delegation is absent. This is the last speaker on the list. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. I now give the floor to the representative of Amnesty International.
Amnesty International comes before the Council with one urgent call. Amid an armed conflict, we must stay focused on the human rights of people in Iran. They live under a repressive system that relies on massacres to crush dissent and demands for fundamental political change. Now people are caught between threats of further deadly repression and an armed conflict involving serious harm to civilians. Meanwhile, the government maintains an internet shutdown. Civilians in Iran are on a dual atrocity trajectory. For demanding transition and human rights, they are met with crimes against humanity. Iran's constitutional structure entrenches discrimination and impunity and denies people the internationally recognized rights to take part in public affairs and freely determine their political destiny. Now, civilians also bear the brunt in armed conflicts, as tragically seen in the killing of over 100 children in an Israeli-US strike on a school in Minab. With violations of international humanitarian law and systemic impunity for repeated crimes under international law, including during successive protests, a wait-and-see approach is devastating for the people of Iran. We urge states to urgently initiate a comprehensive international framework to end violations and deliver justice and rights-respecting transformative pathways for the people of Iran. What actions do the mandates consider necessary in this relation? Thank you.
Thank you. I now give the floor to the representative of Organization for Defending Victims of Violence.
Thank you, Mr. President. The recent aggression by Israel and United States on Iranian territory are not mere geopolitical escalations. They are blatant violations of international law. Madam Special Rapporteur, we appreciate your recent press release calling for de-escalation and accountability. However, the international community must realize the words alone cannot stop the spilling of civilian blood. We need immediate action. We are witnessing a brutal attack on innocent lives. Homes, hospitals, and civilian infrastructure are being targeted one after another, leaving millions of people in danger. The most heartbreaking example of this brutality is a horrific massacre in Minab. Schoolgirls just 7 to 12 years old were brutally killed right inside their classrooms. These children are not collateral damage. Their tragic deaths are clear war crimes that demand global outrage. Beyond physical destruction, the relentless bombings are inflicting severe psychological trauma and paralyzing anxiety upon our children and vulnerable communities. We urge the international community to break their silence, stop the shocking and endless crimes of the US and Israel, and hold them accountable before more innocent blood is spilled. We strongly urge these two mechanisms to immediately launch an investigation into all crimes committed against Iran and Iranians since February 2026. I thank you.
Thank you. This was the last speaker we could accommodate. Excellencies, distinguished participants, this brings us to the end of this meeting. We will reconvene in the afternoon at 2:30 p.m. to continue the joint interactive dialogue on the situation of human rights in the Islamic Republic of Iran and listening to the High Commissioner's oral updates on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and on the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela, followed by general debate under item 4. I hereby close the 32nd meeting of the 61st session of the Human Rights Council.
Thank you. 2:30.
Yeah.